Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back after a short break. I'm PhD candidate in systems engineering and I'm the organizer of eMERGE. Our weekly eMERGE seminar is a dedicated platform for early career researchers to present their research, refine ideas, and build up communities across all of our peers. Today, we are very excited to have Sonia Martin, who's a PhD candidate in the Stanford Sustainable Systems Lab, advised by Prof. Ram Rajagopal. Her research centers around electric vehicles and their integration with the grid. Specifically, she designs optimization algorithms both for managed EV charging and residential battery storage operation to reduce emissions, costs, and grid infrastructure upgrades from increased EV adoption. Sonia received her master from Stanford University in 2022 and a bachelor's degree from UC-Berkeley in 2020, both in mechanical engineering. And today, her topic will be electric vehicle and the grid, managing infrastructure stream, electric vehicle to grid potential, and emissions, which is a topic I'm super excited in. So without further delay, please join me welcoming Sonia for her presentation.
You see it on the Zoom?
Yeah. Right.
Wow,
Perfect.
okay, hey, let me see. Perfect. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Sonia. I'm very excited to talk today about electric vehicles of the grid, managing infrastructure strain, vehicle to grid potential, and emissions. And I wanted to start by introducing myself, and I realized about a few months ago that if I go to the big game this November, it will be my 10th big game as a student of either Berkeley or Stanford, which I was like, that's a really long time. So here's a picture of me. I think I was a senior at Cal at the big game, and me on the left with still supporting Cal, but with my Stanford friends who I also like very much. So I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering here, and then I'm currently a 6th-year PhD student in the Stanford Sustainable Systems Lab, advised by Professor Ram Rajagopal. Here's a little picture of our lab group in our kind of simulated grid and connected home loads environment. And I want to start out by talking about EVs and what are the challenges of scaling EVs. So first thing is that we know sales of particularly passenger electric vehicles are continuing to grow as clean energy capacity increases. On the left, we have a plot of zero emission vehicle sales in California, up to almost 2.5 million at this point. We'll probably hit that very soon. And on the right, a plot of projected renewable resource growth in WEC, which is the Western US grid interconnection. And so with kind of both of these trends, there's this really big opportunity for passenger transportation to have zero operating emissions from electricity generation. And that's a really good thing, especially for climate change. However, there are a variety of challenges associated with scaling up EVs and scaling up integration of EVs with the grid. And I want to kind of start by introducing these challenges by showing this very basic grid model here. Generation, we have power flowing to transmission grid, then the distribution grid, and finally this end use of EV charging. And so I'll use this kind of diagram to help highlight the different challenges from EV charging that I'll talk about today. So first challenge I want to mention is capacity. So I'm looking specifically at grid infrastructure in the distribution grid, and even more specifically looking at distribution grid transformers. So with high penetration of EVs and peak load from or peak power demand from charging, that can age the transformers and cause them to need to be replaced. If they're replaced, there's a backlog and that could delay installation of new EV chargers. So there's kind of a vicious cycle there. And what kind of part of the grid we're looking at here is distribution grid, also could have some distributed energy resources connected to, but looking here at infrastructure in the distribution grid, which is a challenge when we're scaling up EVs. The next challenge is power. So thinking about power for EV charging demand. Increased charging demand means we need increased generation with a lot of more renewable resources coming onto the grid. There's also supply side intermittency, which is a problem as well. And so meeting this increased demand in a clean way is also the challenge. And looking at the grid here, we have kind of two sides. There's the generation side where the power is coming from, but also looking at the end use, the EVs, and a potential for bidirectional charging, which I'll also get into later. And finally, the last challenge I'll talk about is emissions from EV charging. And just looking at the statement here, until the grid runs on 100% clean power, there's still going to be emissions from electricity generation associated with EV charging. And so that's kind of a problem as we want to transition to fully clean transportation is understanding and mitigating these emissions. And here we're kind of looking at both on the power generation side again, and also thinking about timing of EV charging. When can you charge the EV? Can you do that at a cleaner time? So lots of challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities from DERs or distributed energy resources in electric vehicles to help scale EVs, specifically that they are controllable and flexible loads. And so from capacity, power, and emissions, I'll talk about a few different opportunities from DERs and EVs. The first is aggregate control, which is that if DERs are cloud connected, they can be controlled centrally, and that can help increase the utilization of DERs such as batteries. And in turn, this can help us increase utilization of existing distribution system infrastructure. Secondly, bidirectional power. I mentioned this a little before, but enabled by power electronics, EVs could act as a stationary battery, provide power back to the grid, and help stabilize the grid as well. And our question here, or kind of our opportunity, is how can we help facilitate adoption of residential vehicle to grid or bidirectional charging? Last opportunity I'll talk about is real-time data. So in a hypothetical world, we have EVs and chargers connected to the cloud and also simultaneously real-time grid emissions and understanding emissions in real time. And so with these two types of data combined, we have our question of how can we help minimize emissions from charging and understanding and how to control EVs in real time to reduce emissions. These are kind of opportunities I look at in my research, which in general is, I would describe it as creating solutions for scaling passenger EVs. So specifically in my research I'll talk about today, I combine various models of the grid, also with models of different grid devices, EVs, transformers, other batteries, other DERs, etc. And with these models, I use them to analyze the impact of passenger EVs on the electricity grid. And lastly, using all of this, I propose solutions for EV and DER management to hopefully alleviate these different grid impacts. And as I alluded to earlier, I'm going to organize my talk today into these three categories: capacity, power, and emissions. And we will start with capacity. So again, we're looking here at the distribution grid specifically. So this kind of part of the grid. And this particular section is called Protecting Transformers with Aggregate Virtual Battery Control. And to introduce the problem, we know that with kind of the rise of residential EV chargers, distribution transformers are reaching capacity limits. This particular plot is showing over the course of a week, the blue household demand for 6 homes and adding EV charging at 3 of those homes in the red. And you can see here, even just qualitatively, there's a really high increase in peak load from this EV charging, and that can damage the transformers. We see these spikes. We also know that potentially over 80% of distribution grid transformers will experience like violations, so exceeding their capacity by 2050. So this is of course a problem. And As I mentioned, you could upgrade the transformers. However, the upgrades are backlogged up to 3 years. They're also very expensive. And so that brings me to my question of what DER or electric vehicle management solutions can help us preserve the transformer lifetime while being economically feasible and reducing consumer electricity bills. And this idea is, instead of upgrading the infrastructure, can we use existing or new DERs or other assets to help preserve the infrastructure instead of upgrading it? And so I want to talk about what is some existing work in this space, and particularly managed charging and battery sharing algorithms. And the problems with these existing algorithms are that they're generally inflexible. So one thing that we could do is manage or control EV charging at homes to help protect transformers. But this relies on the EV for flexibility, and if someone decides to charge and ignores some potential control signal, this particular method may not work and could be inflexible. On the other hand, another option is some sort of community shared battery and solar system, and that can be very useful, but also does not present the homeowner with any sort of autonomy over their control. And that might be desired, especially if they are paying into such a system. So overall, these kind of existing solutions are slightly inflexible for a variety of reasons. And I want to introduce this concept of battery virtualization, which is a technique we use to control residential batteries and help us introduce a flexible way to again control DERs and protect transformer lifetime. And battery virtualization allows for flexible aggregation. So to explain this, we kind of start with two physical batteries, and what this virtualization does is combine this into a virtual battery. And so a control algorithm could then see the virtual battery, and the software would pass down commands to the physical batteries. This is flexible in the sense that a battery drops offline, something happens, etc. It can recalibrate without the controller needing to update. In addition to aggregation, you could also partition the batteries. And this could look like one physical battery being broken up into different partitions or fractions, and then controlling these partitions separately. And I'll talk about that also in a minute. So with this battery virtualization, we introduce these optimization algorithms using virtualization to help protect transformer lifetime. And our simulation is assuming we have this system diagram here with different homes under a single distribution grid transformer. The homes have solar, other DERs, an EV charger, and a residential battery. And I'll go through the different optimization schemes that we looked at. First is individual optimization. Every homeowner has a battery and they optimize it, cost optimize it for themselves. We also kind of have a slight adaptation on this optimization to better account for different homeowner load peaks. And third, we have joint optimization, which I also call complete sharing. So pretty analogous to a community shared battery. And then the last two, hybrid and dynamic optimization, leverage virtualization to partition batteries into two parts, where a homeowner has one partition that they optimize for themselves and another partition that they share or kind of donate to the collective. The hybrid has a fixed partition size, while dynamic optimization is able to vary the partition size based on solar generation and other factors. And so I'll start to show some results here of what happens when we implement these optimization algorithms. And so I'm showing this simulation, which is a week from July 2018. And we're comparing here this dark blue line, which is what the aggregate neighborhood demand looks like, with no batteries at all. And you can see these transformer limits in either direction, we're exceeding these with no battery. When we add in individual optimization, except for this first day here, we're able to keep the total demand under the transformer limit. But when you have the joint optimization, you also do that, and you reduce some of the solar curtailment, which is preferred and also is more cost effective, as we'll see on the next slide. But overall, the battery is able to, of course, time shift power from excess solar to offsetting the EV peaks and protecting the transformer. So this is great, kind of a qualitative look at this, but we also want to understand quantitatively what's happening to the transformer and what are the cost implications of this. So with this particular plot, I'm comparing each of these 5 optimization algorithms I mentioned before and looking at their transformer loss of life. So this is the percentage out of 100%. And you can see without the battery in our simulation system, the top fraction of homes have a 2 or 4% loss of life within a month alone. So you can do the math, that's not very good. But adding a battery reduces the loss of life by a lot because the batteries are able to keep the power under the transformer limit. So loss of life looks pretty good. All of the algorithms are fairly similar in this regard. And then lastly, I wanted to look at cost. So we have our cost here for no battery. This is total system cost in the neighborhood. With individual optimization, you can reduce this, you can kind of cut it in half, but you can see here that joint optimization is a lot better and almost half of individual optimization. So better storage utilization from the joint optimization helps with costs a lot. And lastly, I'll highlight the hybrid and dynamic cases. In terms of cost, they're not the best. They're pretty good for loss of life. But what is good about this is that homeowners have a fraction of the battery that they can keep for themselves, and that can be important if they want to save some for home backup or use it for another purpose. So comparable results, but maintaining homeowner autonomy. And so to wrap up this section, we show that virtualization is enabling this flexible battery aggregation for transformer protection. We talked about batteries are very effective for this, and joint optimization has the best storage utilization in comparison to the other optimization schemes. And lastly, that hybrid and dynamic optimization have similar performance, but again, they maintain this homeowner autonomy, which could be particularly important. And I'm gonna move on to the next section, but I guess, are there any questions right now after this one?
Can you say something more about the objective in your optimization? Which costs are included in
Yes,
objective?
so it's, we are weighting the transformer aging, so basically there's a penalty for the total aggregate power exceeding the transformer limit. I think it's a quadratic penalty, so fairly simple. But the main is cost optimization. So assuming these homes are under a time of use pricing plan.
And for dynamic partition, what drives the user to reserve part of it? What's the
Yes.
rule of this?
Yes, no, this is a good question. So what we do for dynamic optimization is if I remember correctly, we look ahead of time at the user's loads and forecast loads and solar generation for either a week or for a month. And from that, we determine the optimal partitioning. And so that maybe that's just fixed throughout the whole month. Maybe it's not fixed because they're on vacation and they can share the whole battery. So we do that ahead of time, and then using those fixed partitions, we can feed that into the optimization algorithm. Yeah.
For the costs, are they just basically like accounting for like transformer replacement costs, battery installation costs, and like energy costs and having these pricing?
Yeah, so for this, my next chapter, I look at capital costs. This particular work, I'm not looking at capital costs at all. I'm just looking at operational costs. So
I
you
was wondering
could-
why that first one was so much higher.
Yes.
You weren't considering the battery cost.
Right, so this is over the course of a month. I could do this in the future, but basically look at, you have a few $1,000s savings for this neighborhood per month. How long is the payback period for the capital cost of that, which they're expensive. So you have to do comparison with that. Would that happen over the course of the battery's warranty, basically?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about what is the aggregation method for the batteries, because I think not all the batteries are the same. Maybe the parameters are similar or some. How do you group them together?
Yeah, so we look at, I won't go to another slide, the virtualization software takes care of it. And right now, what we look at specifically is looking at the batteries quoted, at least manufacturers quoted maximum C rates, and we make sure that within the aggregate, you're not exceeding one of the C rates. So there is some math that goes into that in the virtualization software to ensure that you're still meeting the parameters of kind of the minimum battery, the most restricted battery plays into the aggregate, if that makes sense. Yeah. Cool, okay, I will move on to power. So in this, I will look at capital costs, but we're thinking about optimizing vehicle to grid under demand response and dynamic pricing. So switching gears a little bit, so we're still kind of toward the distribution network, but looking at vehicle and bidirectional charging and optimizing the vehicles instead of the DERs here. So I want to first talk about, in case people don't know, vehicle to grid charging and what is it? So it allows power to flow from the vehicle back to the grid and basically enables the EV to act as a stationary battery. And I have a list of a few different benefits of vehicle to grid charging. There are others, but one is being able to shave expensive peaks from home loads. Secondly, being able to participate in demand response programs that can provide compensation for energy export to the grid. There's also, which I think is super important, providing home backup power during power outages. And lastly, if a home has solar or some other DER attached to it, could help increase reliance on this clean energy source. So a variety of great benefits. I think it could be potentially very useful, but the issue is that can it be profitable or even can it be economically feasible? And so there's a lot of different studies that kind of simulate V2G and look at aggregated vehicles together and participation in various grid services. But we want to look at kind of what's happening with V2G on a residential level and on an individual scale. If you were a homeowner in California or somewhere else in the US, would this be economically feasible for you? And so I also want to talk about who are some of the other stakeholders involved other than the vehicle owner or homeowner. One is auto OEMs. They're the ones, building the vehicle and potentially enabling or building this feature or leaving it out, and they want to know if there is a business case. And secondly, different types of EV aggregators who might want to understand, again, what is the economics of this as their flexibility and driver behavior and willingness to participate in V2G. And so again, we want to understand how profitable this is. And I'm looking specifically at this case study of demand response and dynamic pricing programs, which I'll go into in detail. But the research questions here are, again, can this be profitable? But there's also a second research question, which is how can driving and charging patterns influence this economic feasibility? Are driving and charging patterns leading this service to be really restrictive and not feasible, or is it the other way around? So my research kind of comes from answering these two questions simultaneously. And so for the simulation to try to answer these questions, I am using this real vehicle data set with Volkswagen, who are our research partners, and they have real driver behavior and it's vehicle centric. So it provides battery state of charge, mileage, location, etc. And that enabled us to know kind of real driver behavior. When are drivers available to charge, when are they not? And I'll get into now demand response and dynamic pricing programs. So just to explain what are these particular mechanisms of compensation. So I'm looking at this case study in California and in PG&E specifically for demand response. One example is the emergency load reduction program, which is California-wide, and it offers isolated events with a compensation of $2 per kilowatt hour. So it can be very profitable. And secondly, looking at PG&E's hourly flex pricing program pilot, which is dynamic pricing, and that reflects particular grid conditions. And I want to show a plot here of one particular circuit, and we're looking here at different 5 different weeks from last year overlaid on top of each other, showing the dynamic prices. And what you can see here is this purple week, this first one, really low prices. There's a very low price spread. But these 2 weeks here, the green and yellow, very high price spread, prices exceeding $1 per kilowatt hour during these peak times. And if you're selling energy back to the grid, that could potentially be profitable. And lastly, these particular rectangle peaks here are the ELRP or emergency load reduction program events at $2 a kilowatt hour. So we're modeling that in here. Yeah.
Question. Who are directly facing these prices? Are they end users or some aggregators or users participating in specific programs?
Yeah, so this hourly flex pricing pilot, I think it's available to, as far as I know, to all of the above. Definite residential users can sign up. I know Zoom, which is the school bus operator in Oakland that has vehicle to grid charging in their school buses, they subscribe to this too. They have, the prices are slightly different depending on your PG&E rate plan, but you can enroll in this as you enroll in a particular subset of entity, individual, aggregator, etc. So it's all of the above. Yeah. The prices vary a lot. And so I wanted to kind of simulate what happens when you are optimizing based on these prices. So trying to charge your vehicle when the prices are low, discharge your vehicle when the prices are high, and you can get money from the energy export. And talking about what does this look like on the modeling side. So we're optimizing individual vehicles based on their charging and driving data. We have a variety of different inputs here. So demand response program, the hourly prices, both of which I talked about. Also adding in battery degradation, cost, cyclic, and calendar aging. From this behavior optimization, we have kind of, well, 3 different types of optimization. But first we look at the baseline, so no optimization and no vehicle to grid charging at all. Then we look at managed charging or V1G, so no energy export again. And finally, 2 types of vehicle to grid charging, one where energy export is only allowed at home, and the other where energy export is allowed at home and workplace and public charging. And finally, we look, here's where we incorporate the capital charging infrastructure costs. We look at the net present cost calculation of vehicle to grid charging over the vehicle's entire lifetime. So show some results. So we're looking at this vehicle data set, about 750 vehicles over the course of 1 year, and calculating their charging costs under PG&E's time of use and then dynamic pricing. With no charging control whatsoever, it's a little over $1,900 on average for baseline. When we add V1G managed charging, there's a slight decrease, but it's not a lot, and that's for 2 reasons. One, there might not be a lot of price spread in time of use pricing, and secondly, there's limited flexibility in when the vehicles can charge. But when we add vehicle to grid charging, there's a really big difference. Now it completely knocks out the charging costs, and also the vehicle owner is able to profit. This is vehicle to grid home. If we look at vehicle to grid everywhere, adding more flexibility, it doesn't change the cost very much. So looking at this looks really good, but there's a really big spread. So some vehicle, almost $3,000 in profit. Some, it still costs money to be charging and using V2G. So we wanted to understand what is the spread coming from? Can driver behavior of the different EVs explain this spread? And so to do this, we clustered the vehicles with k-means time series clustering and looked at the vehicle's location to determine its charger availability as a binary variable over the course of the day. And so this particular cluster, for example, shows vehicles that likely have access to a home charger during the mornings and then night, and probably go out to work during the day, and 30% of the time on average, they have access to a charger at wherever they are in the middle of the day. And this is one example of the cluster within the 15 clusters that we came up with. A lot of the vehicles in this data set do follow a very similar pattern. They're likely vehicles that are in single family homes, but not all of them are like that.
How you determine the charging availability?
So this is looking at the the charging data that we have. It has sort of a status of plugged, unplugged, and looking at its location. And so we can see if it's at a location where it charged previously, that's considered available to charge, or it's actively charging at a given time or location, that's considered available to charge. And so we use that to create this feature of charging availability.
I see. Thank you.
And so we looked at these particular clusters, and now we're moving into this net present cost calculation. So we're looking at, by doing the net present cost calculation, we get this total system break-even time. So again, when the profits equal the installation costs. And I'm looking here at 3 different capital cost scenario, low, medium, and high, based on different levels of installation costs. So looking from chart clusters 1 through 15, this is kind of from more to less daily charger access. For cluster 1 here, at any type of capital cost level, we're under 5 years of break-even time, but moving this way, you're now exceeding 10 years. And so once you exceed the vehicle's warranty of 8 years, this becomes not particularly economically feasible anymore. So I talked about behavior and implications of vehicle of V2G charger installation costs, but lastly, I want to move back and talk about this dynamic price magnitude. So the results I showed you before were from this one particular circuit. So one particular home that's connected or enrolled in PG&E's hourly pricing, dynamic pricing program. But different homes and different locations of the grid are subject to different dynamic prices. And this also yielded actually pretty different results. So this circuit 3 and 4 here had much worse performance from including vehicle to grid charging. So we determined that a higher price spread of dynamic pricing, offering these lucrative opportunities to export energy, was better economically than the lower price spread, which yielded worse results. But overall, we found that kind of these 3 different variables, and we looked at how behavior, the installation cost, and the dynamic price magnitudes all influenced the economic feasibility of V2G in different ways. So kind of best case scenario, V2G could yield this almost $1,200 profit annually, and this, maybe more importantly, this break-even time in under 4 years, which I think is pretty impressive. But we also found that installation costs have a pretty strong influence on the system break-even time. And lastly, the dynamic prices had a big influence on the break-even time as well. And importantly, they were much more dominant than the demand response programs, because those were just small isolated events, and the dynamic prices had peaks that were influential throughout the whole year.
Question.
Yeah.
Question, can you go back one slide? What is the reason for how do the circuits differ?
So it's proprietary to PG&E, but it depends. So it depends on kind of what the grid looks like where you are connected. And so what we know is that it might be geographically related, but it might not necessarily be the case. It's a topology of the grid at that point. So it probably has to do with if there's a lot of grid strain already at that particular place, could yield to higher prices. But that's not public information,
Okay.
how each place lines up to what prices we can only infer.
Yeah, okay, because I'm a bit wondered that the prices that you need to pay in the baseline and managed case are pretty similar.
Yes,
So I would have assumed that the prices, that they should, like the
yes, okay,
fluctuation of the electricity price should be pretty similar, but I mean in the
yes,
managed cases, but in the B2G cases, it's different.
yes. So I guess I maybe misrepresented so we looked at dynamic pricing only for V2G. And so so baseline and managed have the same time of use pricing. So in these plots, baseline and managed are the same across all of them, they're consistent, but we compared the dynamic prices for the V2G case.
So there are basically two markets, right? There's one power market to buy electricity from in the managed SM case. And then you combine these two markets, or you generate access to both of these markets. One, the just price fluctuations for electricity buying, and one is the V2G market, basically, right?
Yeah,
And
it's,
then you can access it to sell and buy electricity as well. Or
yeah,
how does
it's
it
a,
work?
it's a little more complicated, as a homeowner, you would subscribe to this pilot and you would pay the dynamic prices, but you're also subtracting off some sort of baseline usage, and that's charged at the time of use rate. So it basically means that you can't, because you saw the dynamic prices, a lot of them were very low. And so it basically prohibits you from having all of your home loads and charging at this really low 2 cents a kilowatt hour price. So it has this kind of stopgap built in. So I guess the short answer is they're not really completely independent. When you sign up for dynamic pricing, it is some combination of seeing the dynamic prices and the time of use prices.
Okay.
I guess I was wondering, do you know roughly how many kilowatt hours are being discharged by battery in these scenarios roughly? Like just
That's a
ballpark?
good question. Well, I can do the math quickly. So I think 12 kilowatt maximum for discharge. The batteries are 83 kilowatt hours, so could be up to maybe 40 if you're doing half. So over the course of, 36 kilowatt hours over 3 hours.
Yeah,
So that it's a lot.
I'd be interested in like what's the annual and like, is there any like recommendation from the automakers on
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
limiting the amount you discharge if you don't degrade your batteries too?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think from
The
what.
speed rate probably matters for that too, right?
Yeah, yes. I think overall, the C rate is already pretty low, 12 out of 83.
Yeah.
So it's already pretty low, which is good. And it's an open question for automakers. It's not built into their warranty right now. In Europe, there is legislation that allows for what they call virtual mileage. It's basically counting V2G discharge as a virtual mile, like using a conversion rate. And so then it's like, okay, 100,000 mile warranty, you can hit that, you can sit your car at home and discharge 100,000 miles worth of energy just by sitting at home, and that hits your warranty limit. But that's not allowed in the US, so there's still open problems. Yeah,
Just alluding to the previous question, I think, so we're not considering the dynamic pricing for the cost of the electricity here, which is why the slopes for the baseline and managed are constant over time, right?
yes,
Cool, thanks.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
What if you consider this dynamic pricing for the managed? I guess why don't we consider dynamic pricing for the managed scenario here?
it's a good question. I believe I ran the simulation once. We could consider it. I think that we wanted to basically look at the effect of the energy export from the peak dynamic pricing. And I think that's definitely worth considering. I also think I need to look up the details of enrolling in dynamic pricing, but there also are some bottlenecks, and I would guess that maybe as a customer, you would not be as interested in jumping over those hoops if you don't have energy export enabled. But I think that's a good idea to look at and see if that would change and have another case of what that looks like as V1, like managed charging.
Do you know how much of these savings come from the eCal program?
Yeah, so I don't know, I don't have the exact number, but it's very little. I think if I go back. My initial hypothesis, I was very excited about ELRP at $2 a kilowatt hour. But then when you see these prices at 150 for about the same period of time and happening every day, it's like overwhelming, like, so probably well over 95%, if not more, because I also modeled ELRP has this limit of, I think it might only be, I don't remember if it's 30 or 60 hours over the summer, but it's one season, and a finite amount of events, so there's basically limited amount for compensation.
Yeah, so let's move on. And we
Okay.
can have this
Okay.
more discussion at the end. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully I'll get through the last of it. Okay, moving on. Emissions, so. Managed charging, green charging, managed EV charging for emissions reduction. Okay. Starting with what is green charging, emissions-based managed charging? We have some energy sources, power sources powering the grid. Could be clean, could be fossil fuel burning. We have our EVs, they're charging at different times of the day. Depending on the grid mix, you could be charging with cleaner electricity versus more electricity that comes from fossil fuel generators and has more emissions. Why is this important also for kind of an industrial standpoint? There's a lot of companies right now with aggregators or other data center companies that want this 24/7 carbon-free power. So that's like hour by hour matching of clean power with demand. And a lot of these companies are using marginal emissions factors as a type of control signal. But the question is, are marginal emissions factors actually effective for emissions reduction? So green charging is desired, it's happening right now, but there's not necessarily a lot of evidence showing that this is actually really an effective way to do this. So we set out to answer this question by looking at electric vehicles in the Western US and simulating their emissions using different managed or green charging optimization methods. And here, in the previous sections, I kind of looked at individual EV managed charging. Now we're looking at kind of managing charging for EVs as a group. So we looked at different numbers of added EVs to the grid, starting with 100,000. With our baseline, so no optimization, we have an average of 563 added kilograms per megawatt hour of CO2. Running the simulation with MEF or marginal emissions factor, managed charging, you have a small emissions decrease, looks pretty good. Having average emissions factor, managed charging, also okay. So this looks fine so far. When we look at 1 million EVs, it gets a little bit worse. Their managed charging not so effective anymore. At 2 million EVs in the Western US, managed charging actually was worse than doing nothing at all. And so that was a really interesting result. That managing large amounts of EVs with these traditional methods does not necessarily reduce emissions and potentially can increase emissions. So from this, we have kind of two questions. One, why is this happening? And secondly, what can we devise a new algorithm to help this be actually effective? So we wanted to look at the marginal emissions factor signal to see if we can understand why the signal's not working so well. So definition of marginal emissions factors is that it's the emissions rate of the next generator to be dispatched when there is a marginal increase in electricity demand. And if we're looking at the Western US again in this January 2020 first week, the average emissions factor, it has a pretty consistent pattern, but marginal emissions factor looks almost completely random to me. And we can try to understand why is it so noisy, why does it look random from digging into the generator merit dispatch order. So generators are dispatched by cost, so starting with the renewables, which we model as being free, and then going up from cost as we increase generator capacity. So this looks very clean, it's very nice looking, but when we look at the emissions that are associated with each generator, this looks very noisy. We're basically oscillating between coal and natural gas emissions. So to show an example here of why it's noisy is, let's say we're at roughly 65 gigawatts of capacity and we add a small amount of demand. On the cost, we move up a little bit to the right. We also move up to the right, showing the next generator's emissions. And that basically doubles the emissions. So you can imagine if we go back, if we're telling all of the EVs to charge at this time of theoretical low emissions, you add that demand, now all of them are being charged from this coal power plant. So that introduces a problem. And so we want to create a more effective charging signal, but it requires some EV and grid models. So we first need our added input demand, and this is from the Volkswagen data set that I mentioned in the last section. We also need our input, so the grid generator merit order. We're again talking about the Western US here. Feeding this into the economic grid dispatch model, and our output is the emissions signals. And so using this modeling framework, we developed what we call the cascading marginal emissions factor managed charging method. And so what this does is basically manages EVs in smaller groups to help avoid what we call the avalanching effects of the marginal emissions factor being really noisy. So first we manage the first small group with the MEF signal. We run optimization, we see the results from that. Then we rerun the grid dispatch model to generate a new marginal emissions factor, which is the new marginal emissions factor based on the updated demand. Control the next group and then repeat the process sequentially. And the very last step, which I think is very important, is after we do that whole thing, we evaluate the added emissions using the grid dispatch model one more time. So very important step to run your control and then go back to where you started to make sure it was actually effective. So last thing, I'll show some results of the cascading marginal emissions factor. So we can start here in January 2020. On the x-axis, we have the number of EVs added from 0 to 2 million. This is the similar data I showed on the plot on the very first slide of this section, comparing the baseline, MEF, AEF, and cascading marginal emissions factor. So you can see as the MEF gets less and less effective as EVs scale, cascading marginal emissions factors are still very effective as EVs scale. In 2030, so looking at the future grid, the average for our baseline is lower because there are more clean energy sources in the grid on average, but the MEF is still relatively not as good. Cascading marginal emissions factor is still effective. We also wanted to look in the summer because grid mix, especially in the Western US, is different in the summer. And we find that especially in 2030, the average emissions factor signal performs better than it does in the winter, but the cascading marginal emissions factor across all of the years we tested and these 2 seasons was still the most effective across the board. So our takeaways here are that we have our driving data and the grid modeling, which enables us to check or to run this charging optimization. We first find that managing large number of EVs when you scale up EVs with these traditional factors is not necessarily effective, could potentially inadvertently increase emissions. And lastly, when we run our managed charging with cascading marginal emissions factors, this reduces emissions by 10 to 20% across the years and the seasons that we tested. So with that, I will kind of conclude the talk and kind of just summarize what I talked about of scaling up and implementing different grid-aware EV and DR algorithms. So first we talked about capacity and how aggregated residential batteries can help protect transformers. Second, looking at residential V2G and how it's sensitive to behavior, dynamic prices, and installation costs. And lastly, looking at managed EV charging and how we can create grid-aware and effective green charging methods to reduce emissions from charging. And so to conclude, I just want to talk about where some additional future research questions that I think are important in this space. These are my opinions, but in terms of capacity, I'm kind of interested in using virtualization and aggregation to create resiliency solutions. So we looked at grid infrastructure, but how aggregate batteries and power outages could be very useful and how could we implement that. For power, I'm curious looking at aggregated V2G. So I looked at individual vehicles, but what does this look like when you have a whole fleet? And lastly, for power, I think that medium and heavy duty EV fleets are a really interesting use case because the charging is really high power and adapting these algorithms for these much higher power charging applications could be very interesting and create some new challenges. So with that, I would like to thank our funding sources, Volkswagen and US Department of Energy, and would love to take any more questions. Thank you.
Great presentation, navigating us through from the generation side to the distribution side, and also connecting all the DERs, including EVs, batteries, PVs, and load. So I'd like to start a high level question, then we will open questions to other students. So, I think there are basically two perspectives to think of EV charger. One is EV can serve as batteries. Second is EV are any demand, so they are like loads. So I just want to kind of like have a reflection on your modeling. In your model, which features you characterize make EVs different from a battery, and which features make it different from a conventional load like a building electricity load?
Yes, yeah, I think my main answer to your question is looking at driver behavior and using the data for driver behavior. I mean, you have a stationary battery at your house and it can be used at any time of the day. You're not limited by, oh, I'm going to drive to the grocery store, or I'm going to drive to the grocery store, but I need to charge the car first. And so those restrictions, to me at least, are the most interesting question in terms of like how I define those models differently. I think there's some questions with battery aging where you are looking at C rates and also different, so battery, there may be low C rates from stationary batteries, but higher C rates that could result from vehicles driving. So that's another question as well, but I would say the behavior is kind of the biggest difference in how I model them.
Just a follow-up question, just curious. So in the last project, there are millions of electric vehicles.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate their behavior in that?
Yes, sampling from existing data. We don't have data for 1 million EVs. We take our existing data and sample it and replicate that. Of course, more information would be useful to look at a more diverse population. We looked at vehicles in California, different places across the US and the world have different driving behaviors. So that would be interesting to look at because we have a pretty small data set right now.
I see. Yeah. Question from the audience?
Yeah.
I was wondering for the emission side, when you talk about increasing emissions and decreasing emissions from these.
Yeah.
It was from specifically like vehicle charging. Does that change if you're considering like total grid-based emissions? Because like I feel like the main way that EV actually change emissions is like when there's excess renewables that are wasted. And that's like a big source for like EVs being able to reduce emissions, like using that like renewable source that would otherwise be unused.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there a difference in net emissions of the grid when you change between the MEC and the AEC?
Okay, let me see if I can answer the question, hopefully.
I think I kind of thought about the answer while I was asking you.
Then we'll go back here. Okay, I think first of all, curtailment is a huge issue. In the scenarios that we modeled, we did not, because we looked at the entire Western US, we didn't see, there weren't any periods of time in our particular simulations where there was renewable curtailment. Now, in reality, that does exist because of transmission congestion, et cetera. So we didn't experience curtailment, so we don't have that model, but I guess as a tangent, in the case of curtailment, the MEF would be 0. And that makes it a very attractive time to charge. The other thing I guess I want to say is that we looked at, we call it added emissions. So this is assuming, I guess, you could assume there's no EVs on the grid at all, and then we're going to add a bunch of EVs, and we're just looking at their charging emissions. So we have already in this plot, we have subtracted off the existing baseline. There's a lot of other questions about using medium run marginal emissions factors or long run marginal emissions factors of when you charge EVs at different times, how does this impact grid investments down the line? And that's a super interesting question, but we are looking really specifically at this just short term, short run marginal emissions factor.
on your proposed emission factors, how you plan to implement it? Because you need different like iterations to posting this.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what makes this challenging is there would have to be, I think, some buy-in from the grid operator, because ideally an EV fleet aggregator would be able to dispatch some sort of cost or emission signal to the EVs, and they would follow it. There's a whole area of understanding whether someone would follow that signal, but they need to have knowledge of grid emissions. And I know there's certain live marginal emissions factors, information you can get, but that's a single signal and it doesn't have knowledge of this entire merit order. So I think that's where the buy-in, there would need to be collaboration between grid operators and a fleet aggregator, so that this information about this merit order and demand forecast is being sent to the fleet aggregator, the EV aggregator, to then calculate this and dispatch the signals.
What do you think about cost of CO2 emissions? Because I'm kind of surprised to see that the merit order effect doesn't work. As you.
Yeah. So, no, it's a great question. I guess,
Or not, I mean, it's working but it's not working as it's supposed to work.
yeah, I mean, so basically what happens is if you assign a cost of carbon, then these basically switch at some point they're ordered by emissions and the cost will look like this, but it will incorporate the cost of carbon. And so if you have a high cost of carbon, you do not need my algorithm at all because it's already incorporated. Yeah. But when you have this really noisy dispatch stack, that's when you need to be careful about marginal emissions.
Yeah. But do you know, like, a chance, I know it's a different topic, but I'm just curious, like, do you know, like, recent developments of, like, if there are, like, some movements in the politics that try to implement such costs, or is it?
In the US, I don't know that is happening right now. It's completely fuel cost dependent and operating costs. They have not implemented carbon costs, as far as I'm aware.
Maybe if anyone want to ask one more question before we end. Otherwise, thank you, Sonia, again. Yeah, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which will be next Monday. Very exciting.
I don't know where this is
It's
gonna be.
one of the, yeah. Yeah,
Let me share it on Zoom, so I do this correctly. Okay,
thank you.
hopefully it's on Zoom too.
Next page. Yeah, our speaker for next week will be Dr. Cong Chen, who is currently a assistant professor at Dartmouth College, starting this fall. And her expertise is on electrical engineering, and she will talk about unlocking electricity demand flexibility, kind of like a broader context, including EV, right? Unlocking this flexibility with dynamic operating envelope market and AI agent. And he was once a energy fellow at Stanford. Yeah. So welcome next week. See you next week. Thank you.